It's night in London. The blackout curtains are tight. The street is quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing. Somewhere behind a wall, a radio hums low. A kettle has just clicked off. A man is unlacing his boots. A child is turning over in sleep. And then, nothing. No siren, no engine, no warning. Just a violent absence, followed by the sensation that the city itself has been struck from below. Not a roar, not a scream. A blunt physical shove. The pavement jumps. The walls flex. The lungs empty without permission. People later struggle to explain it. They say the blast came before the sound. They say the ground rose to meet the sky. They say it felt like the world blinked, and something was gone. That detail matters more than it sounds. You already know the V-2 rocket. You've seen it in photographs and newsreels. The tall, elegant missile. The white vapour curling around it. German engineers standing proudly beside a weapon they believed belonged to the future. It's usually introduced as a miracle, history's first ballistic missile. Faster than sound, impossible to stop. But here's the part nobody tells you. The V-2's biggest victims were never the men it was meant to fight. They weren't in trenches. They weren't in tanks. They weren't even aware a battle had begun. By the end, you'll understand the dark reason the V-2 killed where war usually doesn't look, and why that made it more terrifying than any bomber formation that ever crossed the channel. So ask yourself this before we go any further. What kind of weapon doesn't fight the enemy, but simply skips them, and why would anyone build that? The V-2 was born from exhaustion and frustration, not confidence. By 1943, Germany's old methods of striking Britain were collapsing. Bomber formations were being shredded by radar, fighters, and flak. Pilots weren't coming back. Each raid cost trained crews, aircraft, fuel, resources Germany could no longer replace fast enough. Commanders wanted reach without loss. They wanted a weapon that didn't bleed. No aircrew to train for years, no dogfights, no burning wrecks falling into the sea. Just launch and impact. The rocket looked like salvation. It didn't fly through enemy defences. It flew over them. It rose beyond interceptor altitude, arced through thin air and fell straight down. No interception window, no warning, no response. On maps, it was beautiful. A clean curve from launch site to city centre. Engineers spoke in equations and thrust. Officers spoke in inevitability. And the environment mattered. Britain was no longer a front line. It was a civilian landscape. Tight streets, aging brick, underground railways, buildings never designed to flex under supersonic pressure waves. Cities built for living, not absorbing shock. That density wasn't an accident. It was the target. The V-2 wasn't meant to defeat an army. It was meant to punish a population that thought the worst was behind it. Then the launches began, and the paper logic died. On paper, the V-2 was unstoppable. Faster than sound meant the explosion always arrived before the noise. That single fact rewired every human survival instinct. There was no whistle, no engine hum, no siren cascade, just impact. Crews trusted the rocket because it removed doubt. Once it left the rail, it belonged to physics. Engineers admired its complexity. Officers admired its indifference. It didn't hesitate, it didn't turn back. Enemies feared it because there was nothing to shoot at. But the advantage came with a bill, and the bill wasn't paid on the battlefield. People still say the V-2 was a terror weapon that rained death on cities, that it slaughtered indiscriminately, that it changed the war. The truth is narrower and more disturbing. The dark reason the V-2's biggest victims were never on the battlefield is because the weapon was designed to bypass combat entirely and detonate inside civilian life. That design choice triggered a chain of consequences no one fully controlled. The first dark reason is neurological. The V-2 removed warning from the human nervous system. Traditional bombing followed a rhythm, sirens, engines, time to move. Fear built gradually, giving the body a chance to brace. Even terror had structure. The V-2 shattered that loop. Because it travelled faster than sound, the brain never received a signal that danger was approaching. Muscles were relaxed. People were mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-sleep. Injuries happened at maximum vulnerability. Soldiers live in tension. Civilians live in routine. The V-2 attacked the routine. In dense cities, that distinction was fatal. Micro-scene. A woman steps into a hallway barefoot, half asleep, to check a noise in the kitchen. At that exact moment, a V-2 lands several blocks away. The blast wave races through brick like a fist through cloth. She never hears the rocket. She never hears the explosion. The pressure throws her into a doorframe hard enough to break her spine. Down the street, an entire building collapses inward, burying families who were asleep seconds earlier. And that was only the first problem. The second dark reason was accuracy. The V2 was advanced, but it wasn't precise. Its guidance drifted. Small launch errors became massive deviations by impact. A target zone could mean an entire neighborhood. Military objectives were often missed. Civilians weren't. Rail yards survived. Factories stood. Residential streets vanished. On a battlefield, inaccuracy is failure. In a city, it's a death sentence. The V2 turned randomness into a weapon feature. No pattern, no warning, no lesson to learn. Humans survive war by adapting. Here, adaptation was impossible. Micro scene. A school reopens after weeks of quiet. Parents think the danger has passed. Children sit near windows because the glass hasn't shattered in days. At midday, a V2 meant for a dockyard lands several streets away. The blast wave funnels down narrow roads, amplifying as it goes. Roofs lift, walls fold, the school disappears. The intended target was never there. The victims always were. The third dark reason came from where the V2 forced the fight. It dragged war into spaces designed to protect civilians. Years of bombing had taught people to go underground. Basements, cellars, tube stations. Those instincts saved lives, until the V2 arrived. Its blast didn't simply move outward, it reflected, it rebounded. Enclosed spaces compressed air and then ripped it away. Underground shelters became pressure traps. The weapon punished correct behavior. That breaks trust between people and their own instincts. Microscene, a packed underground platform, no trains, no sirens, just quiet breathing. The lights flicker, not from sound, but from sudden power loss. A fraction of a second later, a wall bows inward. Air slams bodies off their feet. Some are crushed without shrapnel ever touching them. The shelter meant to save lives becomes the kill zone, which leads to the fourth dark reason. The V2 inflicted psychological damage far beyond its physical destruction. On paper, it was meant to break morale. In practice, it redirected trauma onto people with no influence over the war's outcome. Soldiers adapted, civilians fractured, no safe districts, no predictable danger zones. Every quiet moment carried the same threat. Sleep vanished. Concentration collapsed. Hospitals filled with shock cases, people physically unharmed but unable to function. The rocket didn't terrorize armies, it exhausted societies. Microscene. A family sleeps in one room because it feels safer together. The father wakes, not to sound, but to dust falling from the ceiling. He doesn't know why. Then the back wall of the house simply ceases to exist. The rocket hit blocks away, but the pressure found this home anyway. The house didn't burn, it folded. Officials later call it collateral damage. To the family, it's just gone. The fifth dark reason is strategic and cruel. The V2 consumed enormous resources to kill the least militarily relevant people. Each rocket required rare materials, specialized fuel, trained crews, transport convoys, and exposed launch sites. Production drained resources Germany desperately needed elsewhere. Entire factories were devoted to a weapon that didn't stop a single advancing army. What did that investment buy? Not destroyed divisions. Not delayed invasions, not air superiority. It bought funerals. The weapon meant to save pilots instead, drained defenses that could have protected soldiers. That irony cuts deep. The V2 didn't fail because it didn't kill. It failed because it killed the wrong people. Microscene. A launch crew works in a forest clearing. They know Allied forces are close. Air superiority is gone. The countdown finishes. The rocket lifts, shaking the ground. Days later, reports filter back. Civilian casualties, collapsed housing, no strategic impact. The crew packs up again, fighting a war that no longer touches the battlefield. But there's one more dark reason. Quiet, and often overlooked. The sixth dark reason is timing. The V2 arrived too late in too few numbers, aimed at the wrong kind of war. By the time it appeared, the conflict had already shifted. Ground armies decided outcomes now. Logistics, fuel, and manpower mattered more than terror. The rocket belonged to a future war, but it was used to fight a past one. That mismatch sealed its legacy. Now the truth narrows. People say the V2 killed more civilians than soldiers. The truth is sharper. It was engineered to bypass combat and detonate inside civilian space, where speed, inaccuracy, and psychology multiplied harm while stripping away military meaning. That's why its biggest victims were never on the battlefield. And that's why it terrified everyone who truly understood it. In the end, the V-2 didn't change the war's outcome, but it changed war's direction. It proved that technology could outrun warning, that destruction could arrive before fear, that civilians could become the terrain. Engineers didn't forget the V-2. They studied it, they refined it, they carried its lessons forward. Return to that London street. Dust settles. People crawl out of spaces that were safe seconds earlier. There's no enemy in sight, no battle to point at. Just silence and absence. The verdict is unavoidable. The dark reason the V-2's biggest victims were never on the battlefield is because the weapon was never truly aimed at war. It was aimed at life behind it. War punished the assumption that speed equals victory, and the people who paid were the ones who never had a chance to fight back. But even that wasn't the end of the damage, because the V-2 didn't just kill people, it distorted reality. This brings us to another dark reason, one that doesn't show up in rubble photos or casualty reports. The V-2 collapsed the boundary between war and daily life. Before the rocket, war still had edges. Even civilians understood them intuitively. Night was dangerous. Day was safer. Sirens meant move. Silence meant wait. The sky was where death came from. The V-2 erased those rules. It didn't arrive from the sky in any meaningful sense. It appeared inside the city, inside neighborhoods, inside routines. It made every ordinary action feel like a mistake in hindsight. People stopped trusting patterns. If sirens didn't sound, that didn't mean safety. If the sky was clear, that didn't mean anything. If nothing had happened yesterday, that meant nothing at all. This is where fear stops being reactive and becomes ambient. Micro scene. A clerk opens his shop because nothing happened the night before. He hesitates for half a second before unlocking the door. He doesn't know why. There's no sound, no warning. Minutes later, a V-2 lands several streets away. The storefront collapses inward, burying him beneath shelves and glass. Neighbours later say the shop just disappeared. No one can say when the danger started. That uncertainty had consequences far beyond casualties. Emergency services couldn't respond predictably. Fires started without warning. Gas lines ruptured blocks away from impact points. Rescue crews entered zones that looked intact, only to be caught by delayed collapses triggered by shock travelling through hidden structural weaknesses. Cities weren't just being hit, they were being destabilised. Which brings us to another dark reason: structural fragility. The V-2's blast profile was uniquely suited to urban destruction. Unlike bombs dropped from aircraft, which tended to explode above ground or penetrate shallowly, the V-2 often struck at steep angles and detonated with enormous kinetic force. That meant energy went into the ground and through foundations. Buildings didn't simply lose walls, they lost integrity. Entire rows of houses collapsed hours later, after people had returned, believing the danger had passed. Engineers later noted that shock waves travelled through sewer lines, basements, and shared foundations, turning connected structures into single failure systems, micro-scene. Rescue workers pull survivors from a partially collapsed row house. It looks stable enough. They mark it for later demolition. 2 hours later, without warning, the remaining structure gives way. Dust rises, screams stop. The rocket landed long ago. The killing was delayed. War usually announces itself. The V-2 didn't, and that delay multiplied trauma. Which leads to the next dark reason: memory. The V-2 altered how people remembered the war itself. Traditional bombing raids were shared experiences. Sirens sounded. People moved together. Shelters filled. Survival became collective. Stories aligned. The V-2 created isolated terror. No shared countdown. No communal response. Just individuals experiencing catastrophe in fragments. That fractured memory made recovery harder. People struggled to explain what happened because there was no sequence. No warning, event, aftermath. Just a sudden before and after with nothing in between. Psychologists later described survivors who couldn't describe the moment of impact, only the seconds before and the damage after. The brain never registered the transition. That's not just fear. That's erasure. Micro-scene. A man remembers setting a plate on the table. The next thing he remembers is standing in the street, bleeding, holding half the plate. He never remembers falling, never remembers the blast. That missing moment follows him longer than the injury. And now we arrive at the final dark reason, the one that ties everything together. The V-2 normalized civilian vulnerability as acceptable cost, not officially, not in speeches, but in practice. Because the weapon offered no military leverage proportional to its civilian damage, every launch represented a quiet decision. Terror without tactical gain was still worth continuing. That decision echoed forward. The V-2 became proof that a weapon could be technologically brilliant, strategically hollow, and still deployed simply because it existed. That's the darkest lesson. Not that civilians can be harmed in war, we already knew that, but that systems can be built where civilian harm is the primary output, and still be labelled innovation. Return again to that London street. The dust settles, people crawl out of doorways, fires burn without a clear source. There is no enemy to point at, no plane overhead, no battlefield beyond the horizon, just damage that arrived faster than fear. Now the verdict becomes unavoidable. The dark reason the V-2's biggest victims were never on the battlefield is because the weapon was never meant to fight soldiers. It was meant to bypass resistance, bypass warning, bypass adaptation, and detonate inside ordinary life. War punished the assumption that speed equals victory. And the people who paid were the ones who never had a chance to fight back.